Australia is the best country on the planet and we should still be building cars. You might believe that entire statement, you might believe parts of that statement or none of it, but that's the question we're looking at in this week's episode of the CarsGuide Podcast. And it seems, based on some recent news, that there might be life in the old girl yet when it comes to Australian manufacturing. Thank you for joining us for this episode. It's episode 201 of the CarsGuide Podcast. I'm obviously here filling in for your usual host, James Cleary. And joining me is editor Mel Flynn.
G'day, Matt.
And also amazing contributor and also using those initials, Andrew Chesterton.
You might believe part or all of that statement. It's up to you.
So this week we are basically having a look at a story that's frankly been going a little bit nuts for us. It's one that you've written, Chesto, about the future of Aussie automobile assembly and manufacture in Australia. And yeah, it seems there is a future. And then we'll talk about some of the Aussie-made cars, either entirely designed, developed and built in Australia or just assembled in Australia that we've owned or still own. And we'll also touch on some of the feedback after last week's Bonanza 200th episode. So thanks for watching and stay tuned. There's plenty to come. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget, you can jump ahead if that's what you want to do. Now, the question I have for you guys is we need to forget Ford and Holden. Is that right? Is that the correct statement? Because
can't forget Ford. Ford's still around.
Ford's still around, yes, but it's not the Ford,
not as we know it.
Not the Ford that we all loved for so long. Unless you really love the Ford Ranger, and a lot of people do. It's a very good ute. But yeah, I think that Ford and Holden, personally, we need to just leave that in the past. Now, there's a lot of, there's a lot of reminiscence out there about Ford and Holden and what they mean or meant for Australia. At the moment, we're seeing a real explosion in prices for collectible versions of Fords and Holdens because people are harking back to that history. They realize this is never going to happen again. We're never going to have Australian-made cars for Australian purposes. And they were two of the most influential brands in the country over, well, nearly a century, right? So I guess the thing is, Toyota was also here, Mitsubishi was also here. There were a bunch of other brands that assembled cars in Australia. But Chesto, this story that you've put together, titled Ford and Holden 2.0, the new Australian-made cars that will make the Commodore and Falcon look like dinosaurs, it goes a long way to showing us that the future is bright for car manufacturing in Australia, perhaps more accurately for the manufacture of light commercial vehicles and utes locally. Now, in this podcast, we're just going to go through each of the cars or vehicles or brands, and then also have a look at some of the other stuff that's happening in the Australian automotive industry. Chesto, do you want to kick us off with an overview of the H2X Warrego?
Yes. So, in fact, I'm actually going to start with a bit of a caveat, if you don't mind. So, over the course of this pod, we'll no doubt be talking about the end of Australian manufacturing as it pertains to Ford and Holden, this launch of this new era of manufacturing, some of the mistakes that might have been made along the way. But I just want to separate all the people from this story first up.
Good point.
I read about the closure of Ford and Holden, and in fact, toured the Holden factory in its final weeks and met a lot of the employees, etc. And mate, it was heartbreaking. You know, they were great minds and great people, and what happened there was a tragedy. So anything that we say about Holden and Ford manufacturing in this country has nothing to do with the people involved in it, because they were all fantastic. But it did beg the question at the time: what happens to this amazing bank of knowledge and skills and engineering know-how once these brands depart Australia? Does it just fall into a vacuum and vanish? Or do we find somewhere else for it to live? And the answer, does seem at this point, is going to be find somewhere else for it to live. So we'll touch on all sorts of different brands, some going ground up, others doing just major changes and overhauls in this country. But we'll start with a company called H2X and its vehicle, which is the Warrego. Now, H2X started about last year or even just a little bit before that, made some really big noise about producing a brand new ute for Australia, in Australia, built by Australians for Australian conditions. his argument, the boss of H2X is a guy called Brendan Norman. His argument was that, yes, it would be slightly cheaper to build these vehicles offshore in another market, but we have good people in this country. We have the know-how and the knowledge. And if a country like Korea or South Korea, where the wages and rates really aren't that dissimilar to our own, can find a way to build this massive manufacturing industry, then we can essentially do the same. Now, I would point out that he might have found it a little bit harder than he was initially anticipating, because the all new vehicles that he was sort of talking about haven't eventuated yet. It's not to say that they won't. And instead, he's turned his attention to something called the Warrego, which is essentially a Ford Ranger-based ute. It's built using Ford's T6 platform, but converted to run on hydrogen fuel cells. And the idea being that he sees a big market in places like mines and other areas where you might have to go underground. And the big mining companies are, of course, investing a lot of money in researching electric vehicles, hydrogen vehicles, zero-emission vehicles, because they're just so much easier to have in enclosed spaces.
Yep, there's a danger factor with vehicles that run on petrol, and that's part of the reason that these brands, these mining companies, for example, have been running with diesel up until this point. But as you say, the future is looking more and more like it's electric and hydrogen. Mal, what do you make of the idea of a hydrogen version of a Ford Ranger, essentially?
Oh, it sounds brilliant.
Yeah.
You know, like the technology exists to make these cars kind of an ideal replacement for what we have now. The problem is you can't fuel them. But, you know, if you've got a mine, you can have your own on-site filling station. Well, and, you know, all you're dribbling into the ground is a bit of water.
There is one critical element here, though, that which is why it's so popular with mining companies and not with mum and dads, is that the Warrego starts at 189 grand and tops out at 250. That's $250,000 range. Yeah. And we all said the Raptor was a bit exy.
And we've all seen those mining utes that accidentally get stomped on by the big Tonka trucks. Yeah, you don't want to stomp on one of these babies.
Exactly. So let me just give you some basic specs here for a moment. So basically, there's a 66 kilowatt or 90 kilowatt fuel cell powertrain, depending on the trim. You'll get up to 220 kilowatts of grunt. As I said, it'll cost you up to $250,000 to buy it. And I think you'll get about 450 or 500 kilometers in range before you refuel it. Refueling, as you rightly point out, though, Mal, is another challenge.
Yeah. But these cars kind of, you know, do a set job. They're not like, you know, mum and dad family cars that do a bit of everything. They just sort of crawl up and down mines all day long, you know, go down and have a look and turn around and come back.
Exactly. So it's
easier to design for that purpose.
It's a low strain, low stress user case for these sorts of vehicles, essentially. Mal, do you have a counterpoint to that?
Well, I think it's probably high strain, actually, literally, but simple use case. I think it's a standard function.
You want to have good shut lines, because I've seen some of those mining vehicles as they come out of the mines and find their way to the auctions, and they are wrecked after 30 or 40,000 Ks. They are done. Oh,
and they rust as well, because there's all sorts of, you know, stuff under the ground that, you know, steel doesn't get along with.
Now, we've seen other approaches to these mining ways of thinking for the future, including electrified or electric Land Cruisers and so forth. This is obviously the next step, Chesto, don't you think?
Yeah, and look, mate, to be honest, it's not just the ute either. So he wants to have a proper lineup of vehicles, all of which he swears will be made in Australia. In fact, he was investigating land in WA, Adelaide land, which some of us might find familiar, and a few other places. He wants to build an SUV called the Snowy, which is kind of a hydrogen-powered CX-5 sized SUV, of which we've only seen sketches so far, but it looks very cool. And he wants a fleet of hydrogen-based commercial vehicles as well. So it's not just he doesn't plan on it being a one-trick pony. The Warrego is basically a toe in the water. And then eventually he wants to turn his attention to like ground-up utes, SUVs, and light commercial vehicles. Whether or not he can succeed at that is another story, but that's the plan.
Yeah. Can I just raise that I think his line about it being only slightly cheaper to build offshore is fascinating. But I think what we need to consider here is that we're talking about a totally different business to building hundreds of thousands of Commodores or hundreds of thousands of Falcons. This is a small scale operation. Obviously, it adds up, you know, for South Korea, et cetera, when you're building on, you know, massive scale, but clearly not to the small scale we're talking about here.
Yeah, and we've seen obviously hydrogen is starting to become a talking point again. It was a while ago, and then it sort of faded away as the electric minefield sort of took over. Now we've got, if you've seen on our YouTube channel or on our website, carsguide.com.au, we've done a comparison test between two hydrogen cars in Australia, the Mirai from Toyota and the Hyundai Nexo, which is an SUV. So there is interest here, and fleet interest in particular. In Canberra, for example, there's now a fueling station. And so there are opportunities for different organizations and government, for example, to be able to embrace this technology as a future technology that Australia could be using. Obviously, we're a long way from seeing anything like the rollout in California, where you can pull up to a regular petrol station and just fill up in 5 minutes using hydrogen. But that's something that we have to wait and see, I think, is the point here.
Yeah, and that test really taught all of us just how ready those two particular cars are to do normal things. The packaging and performance and refinement, and they just work over a long distance, over all sorts of terrain, if you can refuel them.
Yeah.
It's worth putting out too, it's not just the cars guys either. I mean, we have the capability to produce an awful lot of green hydrogen in this country with the appropriate investment that's now starting to be made, which means essentially not only would we be fuel independent, i.e. we wouldn't have to buy anything in from outside sources, but we would also have a new export market and a green export market to replace the ones that are undoubtedly going to fade out in the coming years. So there's a lot to love about hydrogen if we can get it all to work. The only downside is with an EV, of course, the convenience of just charging it at home. With EVs, we all tend to focus so much on fast charging and charger rollouts and all that kind of stuff. But the reality is, for the vast bulk of Australians, plugging it at home is all they'll ever need to do. They'll never need to visit a public charger. So, anyway, could go either way. And in fact, it probably will both ways, but it's interesting.
And we should point out that the hydrogen solution seems to be ultimately best suited to what we love about diesels for long-distance travel, carting big loads, etc. The eventual big solution to that, which pure electric is less so.
And that's what a lot of organizations around the country are looking at, the future of hydrogen as a potential for, like you say, transport opportunities for trucks, for buses, and that sort of thing. And maybe that's the bigger scale look at hydrogen. But let's move on to the next one, which is ACE EV, which... Chesto, behind you, if you're watching on YouTube, you'll see Chesto's background on Zoom here is the ACE Ute, which is a little ute. And that's ACE EV. What is it? What's it about? And can we believe that this is going to happen?
All right. So ACE EV Group is a South Australian-based company. They have, to this date, made some really quirky-looking cars. So the vehicle behind me is the ute, the YEWT. Ute, and look, it's probably not going to crack mainstream acceptance in the near future, but it
could look worse though.
Could look worse.
Could look a lot worse. There's plenty on the market right now that looks a lot worse than that.
Which is damning it with faint praise, isn't it? I guess it could look worse. But anyway, but their next big push, which is actually really exciting and interesting, is a vehicle called the X1 Transformer, which is a van, but it's also a ute. In fact, it's a number of different applications. It's the idea being that it's built on a modular architecture. It can have a short wheelbase, long wheelbase, high and low roof van options, and even a ute. It can be changed in 15 minutes, so it can be swapped from a low roof van to a ute in 15 minutes. So it's this one van, this one vehicle to suit all of your transport needs that's totally adjustable, hence the Transformer tag. Now,
you guys remember Inspector Gadget's car?
Yeah.
How it would go between a coupe and a van at the drop of a hat?
Yep.
6-year-old Mel is all over that.
Well, okay.
This was 39-year-old Mel is also.
Look, it is really cool and more cool. They reckon it's going to go into some form of pre-production in November this year, and they're targeting a launch in April 2022. Australia. So
that's aggressive and exciting if it's to be believed. That idea of having a vehicle that is and can be purpose transformed to whatever purpose you need it for. I've just seen a press release earlier today about Australia Post buying 20 Mitsubishi Fuso e-Canter or whatever they're called. So the electric trucks. Yeah. So that's a truck. And that's it. It's that body. That's all you're getting. Where something like this, designed, developed, made for Australia, in Australia, potentially with the opportunity to appeal to big organizations like Australia Post, maybe not so much going to be the sort of thing that my dad, who's a tradie, or the florist down the street is going to think about. But it's also a really interesting approach because it does offer you flexibility. And, there are a lot of fleets out there who will buy 100 vans and, they're stuck with 100 vans when, what if they need something
I'd
different?
argue perhaps for the smaller scale trading who currently has, a Fuso, a Triton and a van, like, this could enable you to have one car. Mm-hmm. And if you have a variety of functions in your business, one car's better than three. But also the transition in 15 minutes, that's fascinating.
Yeah, so let me quote the boss there. This is Ace boss Greg McGarvey, who I think you've kind of nailed it there, Matty. He is targeting busy freight companies with major distribution centres, saying that the X1 enables them to fit a pre-packed module straight onto its electric platform and be on its way in 15 minutes. That's one platform that can carry whatever cargo module is required, van or ute, high or low roof. So it is constantly earning its keep, whatever each individual freight mission may be. So yeah, that's very much the plan.
So it kind of reminds me of, like, you remember Better Place, which had the idea that you'd swap batteries out of your car and put it back in. This is taking the battery and swapping the body on top instead. It's really clever in certain parameters, I think.
But to me, that is the future of Australian manufacturing, is that you're never going to be able to create a company that has global presence like Ford or GM, Holden, right? You're much better off creating a niche product that appeals to a very specific marketplace and serving that market because nobody else is. So the thought of Ace selling that ute, for example, next to a Ranger or a Hilux is probably not going to fly. But specifying this vehicle for busy freight companies potentially could.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's not just Inspector Gadget and Ace that have been pondering this solution. Mercedes has had a couple of cracks at it. Most recently in 2018 was it the Vision Urbanetic, that was the skateboard chassis with multiple bodies. But also back in 1995, one that I've always been a fan of was the VRC, where you could swap like the rear section of the body. There were four different configurations: ute, convertible, coupe, and wagon. Love it.
What a dream.
The magic is that, like, this is what car companies already do. Like, if you go to an EV, like Rivian, for example, or anyone with a skateboard, they already have this capability. They take off the R1T top, put on the R1S body, and sell it. The only difference is they do it for you. This time, you do it yourself.
And it's done once. Yeah. I suppose it comes back to, like, we need to consider, remember when they introduced the Smart for Two, and it was, you can swap all the body panels in whatever and, personalize it to suit your mood. I can't imagine many people actually did that.
That sort of approach, I think, was really good in cities like Paris, where you get bumped, you get dented. Yeah. People kick your doors when there's protests, because there's always protests in Paris, So this is
turn them upside down in those, don't they?
Yeah, well, exactly. Or set them on fire. Just how they have that day every year where they light all these cars on fire. So I think that's maybe a good point to move to our next vehicle, Chesto.
Yes.
Now, let's talk about building your dreams, or next port. Explain that one for us.
So this is interesting, actually. So BYD is a gigantic Chinese EV manufacturer who's partnered with a brand in Australia called Nextport to sell their vehicles down under. Now, the difference is, it's not what he says. This is Nextport boss Luke Todd. He points out that he hasn't got a distribution agreement with BYD. He has invested in the company, and as for a return of that investment, they've given him access to a right-hand drive production line in China, so he can kind of alter vehicles as he wishes for our market. So that's step one, right? But step 2 is that he wants BYD to build a ute based on an EV over there called the Tang. He sees it being built in Australia. In fact, he's already invested land in Moss Vale in New South Wales that he wants to become the BYD manufacturing hub. And he wants
that's an hour and a half south of Sydney.
Yeah, exactly. And he wants it not just to do the ute, but to do a range of light commercial vehicles as well that will be, built here in Australia for Australian conditions. He describes the ute as not being, he's seen prototypes of it. He describes it as not being as wild as the Tesla Cybertruck. In fact, it'll be desirable, practical, and a very spacious dual cab pickup or ute. It's more in the vein of the Rivian R1T than it is a classical Holden or Ford, but it's a luxury vehicle that happens to have the carrying capacity at the back. So his target is to build those vehicles in Moss Vale, New South Wales, as well as a whole bunch of other BYD branded stuff. Now, the reason I say it's interesting is because when I wrote this story, a few of the comments have said, well, BYD is not really, manufacturing in Australia. That's a Chinese company. To which I pointed out, well, GM's not an Australian company either, nor's Ford. So what's the difference?
Toyota, Mitsubishi.
Yeah, exactly.
Mercedes, Volvo, Volkswagen.
Yeah. There's been a few over the years that haven't necessarily been Australian companies, but using Australian labor and Australian know-how and, expertise. And that's what this is all about, this renaissance, I guess, of the Australian automotive industry, if that's what's going to happen. I think that idea of having having an Aussie in Australia understand what is working here, what's missing from the market, and how he can basically capitalize on BYD's know-how and expertise in building electric cars, because that's what they do. They do that en masse in China. They're one of the most influential and important brands in that market. Yeah. So it makes perfect sense.
The interesting part as well is that there is undeniably a made in China hangover in Australia, despite the fact that we all use iPhones, et cetera, that are made there. But, people still tend to look down their nose a little bit at Chinese manufactured cars. And this neat sidesteps that issue. Sure, it's Chinese technology and Chinese design, but we manufacture them right here in Moss Vale, Australia. So it does kind of, it's a clever move on his part if he can pull it off.
Yeah, I also really like the point of difference with the luxury vehicle with load carrying capacity, which sounds a bit like what SsangYong has done with the Musso, which is fantastic. It's great when people think outside the square in the ute segment. It's great that Mazda makes one that is good looking rather than aggressive. SsangYong, let's have an electric one too.
Maybe let's consider the Mercedes X-Class and the success it had. But funnily enough,
what was its point of difference though, aside from a badge?
It was a luxury vehicle, Mel.
Premium ute. I actually drove behind one yesterday. I had to double take. Is that it is?
Hey, you know what? Just off topic for a moment. As some of you probably know, we like to scour the classifieds and see what prices used cars are attracting. X-Classes have shot up by $20,000 in the last 2 years because of the COVID effect. So 2 years ago, you could get a base model X-Class for 29 grand when they were clearing out the stock. Now, the cheapest ones around are closer to 50. So that's an interesting point, but it's got nothing to do with what we're talking about. So let's move on. Now, an important note.
Hang on, the same thing's happened to all the other utes, though, as well.
Like there were Triton 4x4s for $34,000 drive away. Now they're $50,000 drive away. So and LDVs as well. LDV T60. I was saying yesterday on the morning chat that we have every day that they were $32,000, $30,000 drive away for a 4x4. Now people are selling 3 or 4 year old ones with 100,000 Ks for $27,000. Good on them.
Hard to find a car at the moment. Can I take us just for one more little tangent?
Sure.
So speaking of this BYD ute, which I clearly haven't seen, but I have seen the Rivian R1T in the metal at a few motor shows around the world. It's awesome. Like it's genuinely a super cool product. I do think this is a topic for another pod, but we are on the dawn of a sort of pickup truck / ute revolution in Australia and around the world, because there is some seriously cool stuff coming, most of it electrified.
Yep, 100%.
There's a Rivian in Australia at the moment too.
Yeah.
So it's starting to feel real.
There's
one here for testing, isn't it?
Yeah, there was some in New Zealand as well, and I think there's one here as well. And I'm seeing a fair few on social media. People are starting to see those vehicles around the world, and I don't think there's been a buzz around an electric product that is actually real for quite a while. We've heard obviously the Cybertruck is now delayed again, and the world is just getting sick of Elon lying, I think. So it's when we see a brand like Rivian, which has got backing from big brands, it's going to be huge.
And it's been a long time coming, but there's a good vibe about Rivian from the product to the ownership experience. So,
and the fact that all
plenty of room for that.
Giant brands have kind of conceded, well, you're doing it better than us, so we'll buy into you rather than do our own. Pretty big wrap.
Yep. Now, an important note: we're not talking about complete vehicle manufacturing in every single instance here. There's a couple of organisations currently rebuilding cars to suit our market, or adding on to cars, like Premcar, for example.
Finessing, perhaps?
Finessing, yeah. I guess you could say that, like Premcar, they are vital to meeting a market appeal that a brand might not otherwise be able to meet. Yeah. So, for example, the Navara work that Premcar is doing with Pro 4X and Pro 4X Warrior, as it might be known, this is another interesting way that brands are embracing Australian abilities, capabilities, and asking them to basically tailor a vehicle to suit our needs. What do you reckon, Chesto?
Mate, I reckon this is probably the most exciting thing we'll talk about today, not least of which because it's real and now and happening as we speak, but also because it is such a great use of Australian engineering ingenuity to create these vehicles that really are sort of tailored for our market. So Premcar is one and Walkinshaw is another, and we'll talk about both in a moment. But I just want to make the point that one of the issues I think with Ford and Holden towards the end of their tenure in Australia is that they were these big lumbering organizations beset by bureaucracy, part of these gigantic global supply chains. And so as a result, they turned like cruise ships, like you could not just pivot to meet market demand overnight. Things were years in advance, right? Whereas companies like Walkinshaw and Premcar have this agility to change stuff overnight. So if we suddenly have a hankering for full-sized American utes, here they are. If we want, Mustangs or Corvettes, which I know are right-hand drive now, don't get me wrong, but if we want Camaros, for example, here it is for you. If we want a Nissan Navara that's better suited to crossing Australian deserts, here's a Warrior. To me, I just think that's the ultimate now in Australian manufacturing. It's so cool. They're cars that are made for us by Australians in Australia.
Yeah, I for one, never really thought that I'd see a Volkswagen product feddled by Walkinshaw, for example, and that this is a hot demand product for the first version of the W580. Then there's the off-roady version coming as well. So they're onto something, and I think there's an appeal to a regular buyer who wants something that isn't just a regular Amarok or a regular Ranger or a Navara or whatever it may be.
And lots of it too. And like these utes are made for, not for Australia. They're made for markets, international markets that have generally they tend to use them for work more than us. And we're kind of unique in wanting them for play and performance and, beauty and all that sort of stuff. So we're, a mere minnow in the whole package for an Amarok or a Navara. But these Australian organisations, enable them to tailor it to our requirements.
Exactly.
And make a better product.
Yeah. And
they employ hundreds of people across those brands. Engineers and everything you would find in a regular car company, these companies employ. And like most things in Australia, it starts with utes, but it won't end there. So Nissan, as we know, is already making noises about warriorifying some of its SUV lineup. It might start with brands like the vehicles like the Amarok and the Navara, but it won't end there. We'll end up with vehicles that really across the board that are made.
Yeah, it's a bit like it's also related to the local suspension calibration that we see from Hyundai and Kia. Just these simple changes can make the car so much better suited to us.
They've been influential, I would say, in transforming the perceptions around some of those brands, because they've turned, we remember the bad old days of the Hyundais and Kias that drove like they were made for Korean tastes, which weren't anywhere. They were nothing like what we have now. The expertise that Australians have fed back to the ecosystem has changed global tunes for some of these vehicles, and that's a massive step forward. Now, I think it's time we move on to our garage, guys. So good chat so far, but let's talk about some of the cars that the Aussie-made cars or Aussie-built cars that we own or still own. Mel, we've only got a couple of minutes, so we can't go into all of them, but you start us off with the two that you still own.
Okay, I'll try to speak really quickly then. I've got two. One of them's right behind me, which is my Holden, which was my first car, and I still have it. I still have a K20 Corolla, which was manufactured by AMI, which turned into Toyota Australia. I've had another 5 KE Corollas back in the day. I've had a WB Statesman. I've had an NZ Fairlane. And I should point out that none of these cars I bought because they were made in Australia, but they were the right cars for me at the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, was
that quick enough?
That was great. And I think that's a really good way of putting it, because, it wasn't like you were hankering for an Australian car in a lot of instances. You were buying what you wanted or what your mates had, or, it was
what was available and what was cheap.
Exactly. Like, could you have afforded to spend 30 or 40% more on something that was Japanese or European? Maybe not. So you went with the cheap Aussie one because there were plenty of them. Chester.
Ironically, though, can I just add to the end of that?
Yeah.
Like the shift in values we've seen since the end of local manufacture has meant that I can no longer aspire to buy one of these locally made products, but I bought a Mercedes for a fraction of what the equivalent era Holden would have cost me last year.
Yep.
So fascinating times.
Definitely. Chesto, what have you had?
Well, so people on this pod, I'll keep this brief as well. People on this pod have heard me say before that my first car was a Datsun 260Z, still my favorite ever car. Absolutely adored it. But it's true, but not entirely true. My actual first ever car was a Holden Chimera that my father, who loved a bargain, was at a auction house, and it was just post one of those ferocious hailstorms across Sydney. And this thing looked like it had been parked at the end of a driving range. Every panel had these huge, like golf ball sized dents from front to back, right? It was absolutely haggard. Anyway, I bought it when I was about 15 because he liked the bargain. And then I looked at it in the garage every day, counting down the days until I could get my license. When it was finally time, we went to get it registered, and the bloke just went, "Mate, you've got no chance. Put it in the bin." So I'd stared at this thing for 12 months and then put it straight into the bin. Then I had a 260Z, and then somewhere along the line, I also had a VC Commodore, which I absolutely adored. It was homicidal in a lot of ways, but I loved it.
I trust it had 6 cylinders, Chesto?
Yes, it did. Yeah.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, so...
Tires at the back that are as bald as I'm about to be. Absolute death trap.
Look, I think anyone who owned a rear-wheel drive Holden product at any point during their formative years knows exactly that situation. So
we found it quite formative.
Yeah, exactly. You learn to steer when you don't have any grip. So my first car is the car that you'll see behind me if you're watching on the YouTube. That's a 1965 HD Holden wagon. Now, I didn't really want that car. I showed up with Dad at the dealership in Fishwick, where I'd seen a VK Commodore that I wanted. And the VK was, it was a really nice car, really clean. I don't know whether I believed the odometer, but so be it. And so I said, I think I want that one. And Dad was like, no, I think you want that HD next to it. And I said, all right, okay. So he convinced me by saying, we'll go halves. And at this point, I'm 14 years old. So, it's a dream come true to have a first car well before you can actually legally drive it. And I also sold it before I could legally drive it. So we did a bunch of work to it. We retrimmed the interior with VN Commodore Executive trim because my uncle's VN Commodore got broken into. And so it got written off. Someone smashed up the outside, but kept the inside fine. So we took his front seats and a bit of the trim out of the back seat and stuff. Anyway, long story short, my first car was a HD. I've since followed that up with a VL Commodore Executive. Then I owned a $500 Gemini, which was a huge mistake. And I made $500 on that when I sold it. It then got crashed into a rock outside Cooma, where I was from. Then, years later, found a great HR wagon, which I loved. Again, I sold it, but should have kept it. It would have been worth 10, maybe 20 times what I paid for it now. $4,500 I paid for it, and it was immaculate. It was awesome. But, hindsight's 2020. Also, I was the co-owner of a KC Ford Laser Gear, which was... the carburetor problems we had with that car. Anyway, now let's have a look at some feedback that we've received. Now we're going to keep this pretty brief as well. There was plenty of people saying congrats on the 200 episodes, and we thank you for sticking with us. If you've been here since the start, that's great. We hope you stick around for even more, because there's plenty more podcast chat to come. And we know that our whole cast special was a lot for some people to follow. I think all of us here will agree that we struggled to follow it at times.
It was an experiment.
Oh, man. So thank you for sticking with it if you did watch it. Now, I will call out just a few of the comments. Someone said they didn't have a username, so maybe they were just an anonymous commenter. A whole team, God, it's hard enough to understand what's being said when there's only 3 people to talk over each other at the same time. You add the whole team, and it ends up sounding like seagulls on the seagulls from Finding Nemo. If you don't know what I'm talking about, look it up on YouTube. Grudlin74 said, congrats on 200 episodes. Great achievement. It was very blokey. And we noticed that was the Sausage Fest. And then, the lovable Peter Panousis also said, great show, as always, lads. Shame Nadal didn't make an appearance, and Nadal being the most represented female of the CarsGuide team. Sorry we didn't get her along. We will aim to get Nadal along on a podcast in the future, and we'd love to hear if there's anyone else that you'd like to see on the podcast, because we'd love to give you what you want.
Except for maybe Elvis. We can't get him on.
Look, I think JC can pull some strings there.
Good point.
Okay, that's it, guys. We are done. So thank you for joining us, Mal. And
pleasure.
Thank you, Chesto. Keep up those stories, mate. They're getting the clicks. Thanks again, always, to Mr. Pritchard in the production suite. Today, he's wearing a genuine Holden Racing Team driving suit. And it appears that he's also got a new tattoo on his forehead of that kid peeing on a Ford. That sticker that you see on. He's got that tattooed on it. He's an interesting character.
That's so Richard.
It is. And Penrith has really impacted him. Make sure you have a chat with us on Facebook and Instagram, or email us at comments@carsguide.com.au, and it'll help us out a lot if you are watching on YouTube to give us a thumbs up. Share this video with your friends, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you can stay up to date with all of our latest stuff. No joke this week, but James has had some time off to come up with an absolute humdinger for next week. So stay tuned. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everyone. Stay safe.